After years of living under the strict control of the HOA board, they finally crossed the line by increasing my fees due to having too many cars in my driveway. What they don't know is that I've been quietly buying up properties in the neighborhood for years, and now it's time to show Lisa, the power-hungry HOA president, who really owns this community. But will she accept defeat gracefully when I reveal my secret? Welcome to my channel. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about Lisa and the HOA. I never wanted a fight with the Evergreen Hills Homeowners Association, but when I saw the bright orange notice taped to my front door last Monday morning, I knew I had no choice. Immediate fine, $500 per month. Violation, excessive vehicles on the property. I clenched my jaw, reading the notice again. 3 cars. That's what this was about. My Chevy Silverado, which I used for my construction business. My wife, Anna's Honda Pilot, the SUV she relied on for her 12-hour hospital shifts, and our son, Michael's Toyota Corolla, the car we got him for his 16th birthday last month. 3 completely normal vehicles sitting in our own driveway. Through the kitchen window, I saw Lisa Carter, the HOA president, power walking down the sidewalk, her pink clipboard and measuring tape clutched in her hands. She stopped in front of my house, took out her phone, and snapped more photos. This was the 3rd time this week. "She's out there again," Anna called from the living room. I exhaled sharply, pouring my coffee. "We're not hiding Michael's car," I said, my voice firm. "This is ridiculous." Anna sighed. "I just don't want any trouble, David. You know how she is." I did. Lisa Carter was the self-appointed queen of Evergreen Hills, running the HOA like a dictator. Last month she fined Mrs. Anderson, our 80-year-old neighbor, for keeping her Christmas wreath up until January 3rd. Before that, it was Mr. Turner, who got penalized for having tulips that were an unapproved color. It was never about the rules, it was about her control. But what Lisa didn't know, what none of them knew, was that for the last 5 years, I had been quietly buying up properties in this neighborhood. It started as a real estate investment strategy, but after watching Lisa abuse her power for years, it had become something more. I stepped outside to grab the mail, taking my time. Lisa pretended to inspect Mrs. Turner's flower beds, but I could feel her watching me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. "Property closing complete. You now own 64% of the development." I smirked, tucking my phone away. Lisa had no idea who she was messing with. Just as I turned to go back inside, she marched up the walkway, clipboard clutched to her chest. "Mr. Bennett, I trust you received our notice." Her voice was sugary sweet, but her eyes were sharp. I kept my tone even. "I did, Lisa, and I have a few legal questions about this fine." She waved a perfectly manicured hand dismissively. "The HOA board has the authority to impose fees as necessary. Perhaps if you attended more meetings, you'd understand how these things work." She smiled, but I could see her calculating. She thought she had the upper hand. What she didn't realize was that I had attended every single meeting for the past 5 years, just not in person. I had sent proxy representatives through the other properties I owned. I had documented every selective enforcement, every questionable fee, every abuse of power. Lisa turned on her heel, calling over her shoulder, "Emergency HOA meeting tonight. 7 p.m. sharp. We'll be discussing additional measures for problem properties." I watched her stride away, my grip tightening on the mail in my hand. I pulled out my phone and texted my lawyer. Time to prepare the documents. That evening, I sat in my office, spreading out property maps across my desk. Each lot was carefully highlighted. 5 years of planning. 5 years of watching Lisa's reign of terror grow worse. Anna stood behind me, arms crossed. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. I met her eyes. "She's been harassing people for years. This isn't just about us. It's time someone stopped her." My phone rang. It was Mrs. Anderson. Her voice was trembling. Lisa had fined her again. this time because her grandson had parked in her driveway for more than 24 hours. I rubbed a hand over my face, my frustration boiling over. As I listened to her, my gaze drifted to a framed photo on my wall, my father standing proudly in front of his first home before an HOA forced him to sell at a loss. He had taught me to fight smart, not angry. I checked my watch. 6 hours until the meeting. By 7 p.m., the community center was packed. Every chair was filled. Neighbors I had known for years sat shoulder to shoulder, whispering among themselves. Lisa stood at the podium, her sparkly pink gavel in hand. She had gone all out. She even hired a professional photographer to take pictures of my driveway from multiple angles, making 3 normal cars look like a used car lot. As you can see, she began, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation, Mr. Bennett's property has become a parking hazard. A few of her loyal supporters gasped, the same people who left their Halloween decorations up until March without getting fined. I scanned the room. Mr. Ramirez, a retired teacher, sat with his arms folded. He had been fined last month because his daughter had parked in his driveway while helping fix his roof. Mr. Collins, a scientist, scribbled furiously in his notebook. He had received a violation for parking an inch over his driveway line during the last snowstorm. Lisa clicked to the next slide, a zoomed-in photo of Michael's car. This vehicle has been parked in the same location for over 48 hours, she announced. She conveniently left out the part where Michael was home from college for the weekend. The meeting dragged on as Lisa presented bogus evidence. Charts claiming property values were dropping because of my parking violations, complaints from anonymous neighbors, probably just her friends, and even weather reports suggesting my cars caused excess snowdrifts. Then she pulled out a thick binder. For the past 3 months, I have documented every instance of vehicle movement in and out of Mr. Bennett's property. I stiffened. She had been tracking my family's movements. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Even some of her usual supporters looked uncomfortable. That's when Sarah Morgan, my next-door neighbor, stood up. "Lisa, isn't this a bit excessive?" she asked. "We're talking about a few normal cars in a driveway." Lisa's face turned red. "You're out of order," she snapped. "You have not been recognized by the chair." Her husband, Robert, the HOA treasurer, stood up, handing out copies of a new bylaw, one that would limit households to 2 vehicles and require garage parking only. I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Almost. Lisa smiled triumphantly. "We will now vote on the new vehicle restrictions and fee increases." That was my cue. I stood up, adjusting my tie. "Point of order, Madam President." Lisa's eyes narrowed. "You're not recognized, Mr. Bennett." "Actually," I said, pulling out my own folder, "according to HOA Bylaw Section 73, any property owner may raise a point of order regarding voting procedures." The room fell silent. I walked to the front of the room, placing a large map on the table. "You see, over the past 5 years, Sunrise Investments has been acquiring homes in this development." Lisa's face lost all color. "And as CEO of Sunrise Investments," I continued, "I thought it might interest everyone to know exactly who owns the majority of this HOA." The murmurs grew louder. Lisa clutched her gavel tighter. "But before we discuss that," I added, sliding another folder onto the table, "I think we should talk about the surveillance activities you've been conducting." Lisa's hand trembled as she reached for her water bottle, knocking her gavel to the floor. The room erupted into whispers. Robert leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Her eyes widened in horror. For the first time, she realized exactly who she had been messing with. Lisa sat frozen at the podium, gripping the edges like they were the only thing keeping her upright. The murmurs in the room grew louder, neighbors whispering to one another as realization spread. She swallowed hard, glancing toward her husband, Robert, the HOA treasurer, who had just leaned in to whisper something urgent in her ear. Her face paled. I could almost see the calculations running through her head, trying to figure out a way to wriggle out of this mess. but there was no way out. Not this time. I took a deep breath and continued, keeping my voice calm but firm. For the past 5 years, I have watched this HOA enforce rules selectively, punish hardworking families over petty infractions while turning a blind eye to real issues. I've seen good neighbors driven out because of unfair fines and targeted harassment. But what Lisa and the board didn't know is that I've been keeping track of every single incident, every shady decision, and every unjust fine. I slid a thick folder onto the table. In this folder are detailed records of fines issued over the past 5 years. I've categorized them by property, showing how certain households, specifically those connected to Lisa and her inner circle, were mysteriously exempt from these rules. Meanwhile, families like mine, the Ramirezes, the Collinses, and many others were fined repeatedly for things as trivial as the color of a garden pot or a car parked a few inches too far to the left. Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her hands clenched and unclenched. Robert looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. I continued, my voice steady. But let's talk about something even more interesting. Money. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out another set of documents, holding them up for everyone to see. Thanks to a public records request and a financial audit conducted by my legal team, I have proof that HOA funds have been misused for years. Thousands of dollars in fees have gone unaccounted for, and, strangely enough, several payments have been made to a certain landscaping company, one that just so happens to be owned by Lisa's cousin. Gasps rippled through the room. Lisa's face turned scarlet. "That's not true," she snapped, finally finding her voice. "This is slander. The board has always handled funds appropriately." "Is that so?" I replied smoothly, flipping to the next page. "Because according to these records, in the last 3 years alone, the HOA paid over $75,000 for landscaping improvements that, as far as I can tell, never actually happened. Not a single sidewalk repaved, not a single tree planted. But what did happen during that time? Lisa's house got a brand new fence, a patio extension, and if I'm not mistaken, a custom-built outdoor kitchen." The tension in the room was suffocating. Neighbors were no longer whispering. They were talking openly now, exchanging angry looks. Mrs. Anderson, usually quiet and reserved, stood up from her seat. "Last year, my roof needed urgent repairs. I asked the HOA if there were any community funds available to help with emergency maintenance, but I was told there was no budget for that." Her voice trembled with anger. "And now you're telling me that money was being funneled into Lisa's backyard." Lisa pounded the podium with her gavel, her voice shrill. "You're all believing him over me? He's manipulating you." I shook my head, placing one last document on the table. "This is the deed transfer record for every property owned by Sunrise Investments, which, in case I haven't made it clear, is my company, and this is the ownership percentage of every HOA member sitting on this board. As of last week, I own 64% of the homes in this development. That means I control the majority vote in this HOA." Silence. A thick, heavy silence that stretched across the room as realization settled in. Lisa's fingers trembled on the gavel. You can't do that," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oh, but I can," I said, allowing a small smile to creep onto my face. "And, in accordance with HOA bylaws, I move to dissolve this current board, effective immediately. We will hold new elections with term limits, financial transparency requirements, and a ban on conflicts of interest." "I second that motion," Mr. Ramirez called out from the back. "All in favor?" One by one, hands shot into the air. People who had been quiet for years, too afraid to speak up, now stood together. The vote was unanimous. Lisa looked around, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her face going from red to pale to red again. "You can't just remove me," she shouted, desperation seeping into her voice. "This is my neighborhood." I held up the HOA bylaws. Actually, Lisa, this neighborhood belongs to the residents, and for the first time in years, they finally have a say in how it's run. Robert placed a hand on her arm, murmuring something. She yanked away from him. "I will sue you," she spat, glaring at me. "You'll regret this." "By all means," I said, sliding another folder across the table. "I'd love to discuss the missing HOA funds in a courtroom. While we're at it, maybe we can also review the surveillance activities you've been conducting on private residents, the fabricated fines, and the unauthorized alterations to financial records." She opened her mouth again, then snapped it shut. Her hands curled into fists. I turned back to the room. Starting today, the HOA is no longer a tool for harassment. It will exist to support this community, not control it. We will use these fees to actually improve our neighborhood, fix the playground, repair the sidewalks, and assist elderly residents with maintenance. No more secret votes, no more hidden fees, and absolutely no more intimidation tactics. A cheer erupted from the crowd. It was over. After years of tyranny, Lisa had finally lost. She grabbed her designer purse and stormed toward the door, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. "This isn't over," she hissed before shoving the door open and disappearing into the night. I glanced at the documents spread across the table, years' worth of evidence, meticulous planning, and quiet patience finally paying off. Lisa had spent years wielding power over this neighborhood, convinced that she was untouchable. But she had underestimated one thing. I was playing the long game. Mrs. Anderson patted my arm, her eyes watery. "Thank you," she whispered. I nodded, feeling a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying finally lift off my shoulders, but I knew it wasn't over yet. Lisa was vindictive, and people like her didn't just slink away quietly. She still had allies in this neighborhood, and she wouldn't go down without a fight. As the meeting ended and neighbors lingered, chatting excitedly about the future of the HOA, I stepped outside and pulled out my phone. A message from my lawyer was waiting. "Lisa just filed a lawsuit against you." I let out a breath, staring up at the darkened sky. I had won the battle. But the war, that was just beginning. Lisa's lawsuit arrived the very next morning. I had expected it. People like her didn't go down without a fight. She had accused me of illegally manipulating HOA regulations for personal gain, claiming that my quiet property acquisitions were an unethical attempt to seize control of the neighborhood. It was laughable, really, considering she had been using the HOA as her personal kingdom for years. Still, I wasn't about to take any chances. I forwarded the legal documents to my lawyer and got in my truck, heading straight to his office downtown. As I pulled into the parking garage, my phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from one of my neighbors, Mr. Collins. "Lisa's been going door to door spreading rumors about you. She's telling people you're turning the neighborhood into a commercial zone, and that soon, outsiders will flood in and ruin property values." I shook my head. She was grasping at straws, but fear was a powerful tool. I couldn't let her control the narrative. Inside my lawyer's office, Tom Whitaker, my attorney, leaned back in his chair as he flipped through the lawsuit. "This is weak," he said, smirking. "She's got nothing substantial. Just vague claims and speculation. No actual legal standing. Honestly, if anything, we have more than enough evidence to countersue for defamation." I exhaled, relieved but not surprised. "Then let's get ahead of this," I said. "She's trying to rally people against me. I need to make sure the truth is out before she poisons the well." Tom nodded. "I'll draft a formal response, but in the meantime, I'd suggest you go straight to the source. If Lisa's talking to neighbors, you should too. Show them what's really happening." That afternoon, I did exactly that. I started with Mrs. Anderson, who greeted me at her porch with a warm but worried smile. "I heard Lisa saying you're planning to turn this place into a rental community," she said. "People are nervous, David." I handed her a folder. "This is a breakdown of all the improvements we're going to make with the new HOA board. Actual repairs, better community spaces, funds allocated transparently. No more hidden fees, no more selective enforcement. She flipped through the papers, nodding. That's more than Lisa ever did for us. Word spread fast. I went house to house answering questions, showing receipts, making it clear that I wasn't here to take over. I was here to fix what was broken. Still, Lisa wasn't done. The next day, news vans showed up outside my house. Someone, I wonder who, had tipped off a local reporter that there was HOA corruption and a hostile neighborhood takeover happening in Evergreen Hills. I could see Lisa standing smugly across the street, watching as reporters set up their cameras. Fine. If she wanted a public battle, I'd give her one. I stepped outside, straightened my shirt, and walked right up to the reporters. "Good morning, folks. I assume you're here about the changes in our HOA." A blonde woman holding a microphone nodded. "Can you explain what's happening with the sudden shift in leadership?" I smiled. "Absolutely. For years, this HOA has been run like a dictatorship, with selective fines, misuse of funds, and harassment of homeowners. What we did was completely legal. Residents voted for a fair, transparent system, and we made it happen. Now, Lisa Carter, the former president, is upset because she lost control. She's making baseless accusations, but the facts speak for themselves." I pulled out documents, financial records, fine inconsistencies, proof of property neglect under Lisa's leadership. These are public records. Anyone can look at them. What Lisa won't tell you is that our new HOA board is focused on helping people, not punishing them. Lisa must have realized her plan was backfiring because she suddenly stormed across the street, camera ready, her voice dripping with righteous indignation. "This man is a liar!" she shrieked, jabbing a finger at me. "He's turning this neighborhood into a circus." The reporter turned her mic toward Lisa. "Ms. Carter, do you have any evidence of these claims?" Lisa faltered. Well, just ask anyone. He's been secretly buying up properties. That's unethical." I crossed my arms. Unethical, or just smart investing. I followed every legal procedure. I never forced anyone to sell. Meanwhile, you funneled HOA funds into your own backyard. Should we talk about that, Lisa? Her face turned beet red. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The cameras caught every second of it. The next morning, the headline ran on the local news. HOA power struggle exposes years of misuse and corruption. Lisa had lost the court of public opinion, but she still had one last card to play: her lawsuit. The first hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. I walked into the courthouse knowing we were about to bury her case, but Lisa showed up looking smug. I knew she had something planned. As we sat at opposite tables, her lawyer stood up and made his case. "Your Honor, Mr. Bennett's actions were deceptive. He used loopholes to consolidate power, misleading homeowners into voting against their own interests." I stayed quiet as my lawyer, Tom, stood. "Your Honor, the facts are simple. Every purchase was legal. Every vote was fair. However, what wasn't fair were the financial inconsistencies in the HOA under Ms. Carter's leadership. We have documentation proving she used HOA money for personal expenses, selectively enforced rules against certain residents while ignoring violations from her friends, and even tracked homeowners' movements without their consent." Tom handed a thick binder to the judge, who skimmed through it, his expression darkening. Lisa's lawyer tried to object, but then Tom dropped the final bombshell. "We also have a subpoenaed email from Lisa Carter, where she instructed another board member to issue additional fines to specific residents in hopes of pushing them out of the neighborhood." The judge's eyebrows shot up. Lisa went completely still. The courtroom fell silent. The judge sighed and set the binder down. "Ms. Carter, you are hereby ordered to reimburse the HOA for misused funds and are barred from holding any HOA leadership position in the future." Lisa screamed, "This is unfair." She turned to her lawyer. "Do something." but he just shook his head. The case was lost. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching Michael park his car in our driveway, the same driveway that had started this entire mess, I finally felt a sense of peace. Evergreen Hills wasn't perfect, but it was ours again. The HOA was no longer a weapon. In the following months, we made real improvements. We fixed the playground, we repaved sidewalks, we even started a community garden where Lisa used to take her infamous yard violation photos. Property values actually increased. Turns out buyers preferred a neighborhood where they weren't constantly afraid of fines. And Lisa? She moved out. She packed up and left one night, her car stuffed with bags, a scowl permanently etched on her face. No one came to say goodbye. A few weeks later, I got a text from an unknown number. She moved to a new HOA, already causing trouble. I laughed. Some people never change. But this time, she wasn't my problem. A month later, I received a call from a TV producer who had seen the news coverage. "We're working on a documentary about corrupt HOAs and how communities are taking back control," he said. "Your story is incredible. Would you be willing to share it?" I glanced out at the street, kids playing basketball in their driveways, neighbors chatting freely, a neighborhood finally at peace. I smiled. "Yeah," I said, "I think it's a story worth telling."